Happy holidays, friends! It's the happiest season, and you know something that makes me happy? Nancy Drew. So I thought, what better way to celebrate the season than to lovingly trash talk a Christmas-themed Nancy Drew novel from 1992. This is the Nutcracker Ballet Mystery, number 110 in the main Nancy Drew Mystery Stories series. On the cover, we have the Nutcracker dead on the floor, brutally disfigured and dismembered. And it looks like Nancy is protecting the children as though they were the intended victims of this attack. Nothing says Christmas like attempted child murder. The spotlight's on Nancy when sabotage threatens to spoil a holiday spectacle. A spotlight, all the better to highlight Nancy's socks over jeans look here. I'm going to briefly read you a synopsis of this book before I do a deeper dive into the story. An evening of ballet leads Nancy into a dance with danger. Madame Dougrand's Dance Academy is in rehearsal for the Nutcracker Ballet, and it could be a huge hit this year. Shauna Edwards, a recent graduate who has made a big splash in New York, is returning to River Heights to star in the show. But the closer the dancers get to showtime, the clearer it becomes that the stage is set for disaster. Someone is determined to bring the production down before the curtain goes up. Theft and arson threaten to darken the theater and doom the dance. But Nancy will have to conduct her investigation with extreme precision and agility. One false step, one wrong move, and the Nutcracker could come to a swift and bitter end. Before I started this book, I decided to check out some of the Goodreads reviews. One reviewer said, "The culprit seemed to come out of left field a little," but someone else claims that they figured out who the culprit was pretty quickly. So, what is the truth? Get yourself a warm drink, get snuggly, and let me tell you a story of Christmas. Chapter 1. Ticket to Trouble. "I just love the Nutcracker Ballet," George Fane declared. Sorry, George said that? I'm not one to believe that a girl can only be one thing, but it feels so out of character for George to love ballet. Bizarrely, the rest of the book seems to back up my belief, with Nancy and Bess helping out with the ballet while George is mostly absent, off having a grand old time cross-country skiing, as fits with her tomboy personality, which had been established for 60 years at the time of this book's publication. George's comment is really just a way to set up the plot, which centers around a production of the Nutcracker being put on by a local River Heights ballet school, Madame Dougrand's Dance Academy. This performance seems to be an annual tradition, spanning back many years. In a rare and beautiful moment of non-mystery related dialogue, Nancy and George reminisce about when the two of them and Bess danced in the show, and they all fell into the Christmas tree on stage. I'm going to start judging Nancy Drew books based on whether they include conversations unrelated to the mystery or not. It'll be my version of the Bechdel test. And I'm happy to announce that this book passes the Snugglydell test. Another former student returning for the production is Shauna Edwards, who, after leaving River Heights, became a dancer with the New York Ballet Company. She is dancing as the Sugar Plum Fairy. Nancy and George head to the dance academy and almost break all their bones slipping on a patch of unsalted ice outside the building. In a very unsubtle piece of dialogue, Nancy announces, "The sidewalk should have had sand or salt on it. Remember how Madame was always so careful? She didn't want one of her precious ballerinas to hurt themselves. Isn't it weird that there's no sand on this ice? Almost as if it were a clue in a mystery I don't know exists yet." The two girls manage to make it safely into the building and find Bess in the costume room. Bess is working alongside a seamstress named Gertrude Wolowski, who is described in such a way that she sounds like Quasimodo in a wig, with a hunched back and wispy snow-white hair. Bess suggests some more indications that all is not right at the school. The school's recently been hit with a rent increase. Two girls have had their toe shoes stolen, and there's been a lot of bickering. If I didn't know this was a mystery novel, I wouldn't think much about any of those things. Even within the context of the book, the culprit could only possibly have orchestrated the theft of the toe shoes. Unless the culprit is Madame Dugrand's landlord? The girls reunite with Madame Dugrand as Nancy wants to buy a ticket to a charity gala for the school. Before Nancy can buy her ticket, however, the fire alarm goes off. Chapter 2. Old Times, New Crimes. As everyone evacuates the building, we meet two more characters. The famous Shauna Edwards and her younger sister, Michelle, not to be confused with Shauna's other sister, Darcy with an I. To tell them apart, you just need to know that Darcy is the jealous and Michelle's the other one. Is that too? Michelle is playing the part of Clara and Darcy is Dewdrop, although she wanted to be the Sugar Plum Fairy and is resentful of Shauna for scoring that role. Once they're all outside, one of the mothers approaches Madame Dugrand and tells her that she's quitting as prop organizer, and what's more, she's pulling little Tiffany out of the school. This fire is the last straw, she says, which I think is an unreasonable reaction to 2 pairs of toe shoes going missing. So Nancy volunteers to help with the props. Nancy, Bess, and George then watch Shauna lead a dancing exercise. The accompanist is a man named Roger Lutz. George describes him as looking like a mouse. He had thin brown hair, and a sparse mustache dusted his upper lip. George was right, Nancy thought. He really did look like a mouse. What kind of mice do they have in River Heights? He doesn't look like a mouse, he looks like an incel. Roger begins playing and the bar exercise begins, but before the dancers can get far, the bar rips off the wall and falls onto Shauna's leg. Chapter 3. Partners in Spite. Like most dramatic Nancy Drew chapter cliffhangers, the outcome is anticlimactic. Shauna is perfectly fine and can still dance in the ballet. Nancy, Bess, and George decide to go for lunch. Let's go to Yogurt Heaven, just like old times. That's right, Yogurt Heaven, a longtime favorite hangout for students at the Dance Academy. And what's more, they still serve the same fabulous low-cal yogurt. That sounds more like yogurt hell. Let me clarify further. This appears to be a sit-down restaurant themed entirely around yogurt, and not even the frozen kind. Bess orders a turkey club sandwich. At a yogurt place? Okay. As they wait for their food, Darcy walks in with Lawrence Steele, who is dancing opposite Shauna's Sugar Plum Fairy as the Cavalier. Not only does Darcy want her sister's role, she wants her man too. And Lawrence, who has blonde curly hair and a great dancer's build, is not exactly opposed to the idea. Darcy was standing awfully close to Lawrence, and his arm was casually around her shoulders. I'd say Lawrence was at least a couple of years older than Darcy, Bess commented. No. Even if Lawrence isn't the culprit, he's guilty of another crime, and he's going to yogurt hell. Lawrence and Darcy sit in a booth near Nancy and her friends and order 2 sundaes. Is no one ordering yogurt at this yogurt restaurant? Darcy is laughing about Shauna getting injured. Maybe another little accident might convince Shauna to go back to New York where she belongs, Darcy suggested. It will probably take more than just a little accident to get rid of that sister of yours, Lawrence said. And you're just the person to think of one. Chapter 4. Accidents will happen. That sounds like a threat, Bess whispered excitedly. Bess calls him like she sees him. Nancy says, I guess Darcy is pretty angry at her sister. Angry? Bess exclaimed. Isn't that sort of an understatement? Darcy and Lawrence both want to get rid of Shauna. I don't even have to make any commentary because Bess is voicing everything I would say. The next morning, the walk in front of the school is still icy, but Nancy and Bess manage to cross it with their lives intact. Nancy goes to check out the situation in the prop room and soon realizes that she's missing a box of ornaments, so she goes to ask Madame Dugrand about them. What? Madame sprang to her feet. Oh, I hope they aren't lost. We're using Mrs. Farnsworth's ornaments this year, and they're priceless antiques. Of course they fucking are. Why would they use anything but priceless antique ornaments for their small-town production of the Nutcracker, in which the ornaments will be too far away for anyone to see, and which no one will even notice because they'll be too busy watching the ballet? But wait, Madame Dugrand does have some further contrived justifications for why these ornaments are so important. See those pictures? Madame pointed to the wall beside her desk. Nancy nodded. These particular pictures, Madame Dugrand said, gesturing toward a cluster of 5 photos, are publicity shots for my former ballet company's Nutcracker. Nancy moved closer for a better look. In one picture, Clara was holding the Nutcracker doll, and in another, the candy canes posed in the land of sweets. It looks lovely, Nancy said. Thanks to the wonderful costumes and props we had, Madame said. That's why I've collected them both so carefully over the years. Every season I try to add something new, a small treat for my faithful patrons. This year, the Farnsworth ornaments were to be that treat. That's why it's so important that we find them. That's why. I understand now. No, actually I don't. That's completely stupid. Nancy goes to see Mrs. Farnsworth, a wealthy widow, thinking that maybe she just hasn't delivered the ornaments yet. However, Mrs. Farnsworth claims that she already delivered the ornaments. Oh, sorry, her chauffeur delivered them because Mrs. Farnsworth would never belittle herself with menial labor like a common male person. This whole interaction takes less than a page. Come on, this is 1992. You have email. Back at the dance school, Nancy goes to watch Shauna and Lawrence rehearse. As Nancy watched the 2 dancers, she almost forgot the harsh words she'd overheard Lawrence utter about Shauna at Yogurt Heaven. You best believe I'm going to utilize every opportunity to say Yogurt Heaven that I can. Lawrence spun Shauna around and with both hands on her waist began to lift her high into the air. But the romantic mood disappeared when Lawrence suddenly lost his balance. Shauna sailed backward over his head, a look of horror on her face. Whoops, Butterfingers! Chapter 5, Dangerous Playthings. Shauna screamed as she flew over Lawrence's head toward the wooden floor. I love the image of Shauna flying through the air like a hacky sack. In another anticlimax, Lawrence catches her and somehow prevents her from flying across the theater. I don't know how, as they mention her flying away from him twice, as though it's a progression of events, but if there's one thing I know about Carolyn Keene, it's that she's a real killjoy. Lawrence and Shauna both blame each other for the mishap. Lawrence claims that Shauna was wiggling around too much, while Shauna says that Lawrence fumbled his grip on her. Lawrence storms out, and Shauna confesses that she and him used to be, friends. And we all know what that means. Maybe we should tell Shauna what we overheard at Yogurt Heaven, Nancy, George suggests. George is here to cross-country ski and start drama, and she's all done cross-country skiing. Nancy and George return to the prop room, and when they get there, Lawrence storms out. That guy, he's always just storming all over the place. For some arbitrary reason, Nancy and George decide to move a pair of papier-mâché pillars. As she and George steadied the pillar, Nancy looked up. The ceiling was so dark she couldn't see very well. But when she stepped back, she saw something that startled her. Perched on the top of the pillar was a wooden doll. It grinned down at her with a sinister smile. "George, stop!" Nancy cried as a 3-foot-tall doll began to teeter on the edge of the pillar. But Nancy's warning came too late. The doll toppled from the column, heading straight for George's head. Chapter 6. Staged for trouble. George survives as the doll misses her head by an inch. "I'm fine," George assured Nancy. Then she nodded towards the grinning doll, which was now lying on the floor, its head at an odd angle. "But I'm afraid he's not. I'm afraid there's no point in calling an ambulance. He's already dead." Nancy bent down to pick up the doll's head. The brightly painted face with its smiling mouthful of teeth looked even more sinister without its body. The doll did it, and it will kill again! However, Nancy suspects Lawrence of booby-trapping the pillar, and I think he gives her reason to. "You two had better be more careful," he said in a low voice. Then, tossing the Nutcracker's body to Nancy, he added with a chuckle, "You wouldn't want to lose your head like this poor fellow, would you?" "That sounds like a threat." Bess goes to pick them up some food for lunch from Yogurt Heaven. She returns with a sandwich for herself, which is not yogurt, and tuna rolls for Nancy, which are also not yogurt. Bess, however, has trouble eating because she thinks the doll is watching her, so George turns it over so its face is hidden. Even Nancy was glad the Nutcracker was no longer looking at them. "Haunted, cursed, the doll did it, I'm telling you!" Nancy goes to watch another rehearsal and snow starts falling unexpectedly onto the stage. Just remembered I intended to wear this collar for this video, so let's just pretend I was wearing it all along, shall we? Nothing's going right for me tonight. Must be sabotage. Lawrence slips and knocks into Madame Dugran, who, unlike Shauna, really does fly off the stage and across the recital hall. I'm imagining when you let go of a balloon full of air and it abruptly flies across the room. Except instead of a balloon, it's a middle-aged ballet teacher. Chapter 7. Big preparations. The directress was sprawled on the wooden floor, her arms and legs jutting out at odd angles. Her eyes were closed. Oh, she's definitely dead. No, wait, she's completely fine. She doesn't even have any broken or sprained bones, despite all her limbs sticking out at odd angles. This is the only sort of payoff we get for the slippery patch of ice outside, by the way. It really felt like it was setting something up, especially as it's mentioned multiple times. And I thought it would be revealed that the culprit had intentionally poured ice all over the ground. But no, apparently it's just innocent neglect. I suppose it could be interpreted as incredibly subtle foreshadowing for this event, as Madame Dugran does technically slip on snow, but I think that's too clever for this book. That night is the dance school's charity gala, and Nancy and Bess stop at the school on the way, as Bess forgot something there. The icy walk is mentioned again as Nancy and Bess walk up to the building, but yeah, sure, it means nothing, I guess. Once inside, they hear suspicious sounds coming from the prop room. Bess says they should call the police. Nancy shook her head emphatically. "If we wait for the police," she whispered, "whoever it is might get away." Absolutely awful take. You are two teenage girls in fancy party outfits. What are you going to do? Stepping into the prop room, Nancy felt along the brick wall for the light switch. Bess was so close behind her that she kept stepping on Nancy's heels. Grrr! A loud growl made Nancy swing around. Bess screamed as a black shape jumped up from behind the shadowy sled. Bess screamed again as the creature lunged for the door. In the dim light from the hall, Nancy could see it had a huge head and pointy ears. "A monster! And it's coming after us!" Bess cried, shrinking back against Nancy. "Stop, whoever you are!" Nancy pushed past Bess, trying to reach the creature, but her leg hit something solid and she tumbled over a box. At the same time, the monster bolted past her and out into the hall. A furry! Nancy leaped toward the open door. Wham! It slammed shut in her face. Nice Easter egg reference to the band responsible for the hit holiday single Last Christmas. Quickly, Nancy searched for the doorknob, but then she heard a click. With a sinking feeling, Nancy turned the knob, then rattled it. Nothing happened. Nancy and Bess were locked in a pitch-black room. Chapter 8. In the Lair of the Mouse King. What in the world was that? Bess finally asked. Believe it or not, I think it was the Mouse King, Nancy said. Bess laughed nervously. The Mouse King? You're kidding. Who would be crazy enough to run around in a 7-headed mouse costume? Nancy was trying to decide what to do next when Bess suddenly grabbed her arm. Nancy, she whispered, do you hear squeaking? Nancy stopped to listen, then nodded. Yes, and I'm pretty sure I know what it is. Don't panic, but it sounds like mice, Nancy said. You know, those harmless little furry creatures. Would you rather be trapped in a room with 7 mice or a 7-headed mouse king? Let me know in the comments. The lights abruptly turn on and the door flies open. Caught you, a voice cried. Whirling around, Nancy and Bess found themselves face to face with Lawrence Steele. He was brandishing a tire iron menacingly. Neither Nancy nor Bess questioned this, but I personally would be a little concerned about how eager Lawrence seems to be to beat someone up with a tire iron. The girls fill Lawrence in on what happened, and then Nancy mentions that she thinks there are mice in the room with them. Mice? Lawrence interrupted. He fell to his knees and began crawling around. Have you gone crazy? Bess inquired as Lawrence crawled past her. Crazy enough to run around in a 7-headed mouse costume by any chance? Lawrence goes on to say, I'm looking for my mice. The mice in here must be the ones that were stolen from my locker a couple of days ago. You keep mice in your dance locker? Not usually, only when I plan to feed my snake. Aha! Lawrence said suddenly, pouncing on something. Getting to his feet, he held up a struggling white mouse by its pink tail. Lawrence slipped the mouse into a pocket of his tweed topcoat. Everything about this situation is amazing. Fun fact, Lawrence's snake is never remarked upon by any of the characters, and in fact is never mentioned again. Lawrence says, You figured it was me wearing a giant mouse head. I guess you don't seem to trust me very much, Ms. Drew. Nancy raised her brows. What makes you say that? Oh, it's just a feeling I get, Lawrence replied. He picked up the tire iron and slapped it across his left palm. No one seems to believe in me these days. Sir, can you please put that tire iron down? I don't like how it's looking at me. Lawrence leaves, and Nancy wants to look around more, but Bess says, No way. If Lawrence is lying, he'll be after us in 2 seconds. I can't believe Bess is the voice of reason in this book. They get outside just in time to see the school van tear out of the parking lot, and Nancy decides it's time to add some more action to this book with a car chase. The van pulls an Uno reverse card on Nancy and Bess by somehow getting behind them and ramming into the back of Nancy's Mustang until it finally hits them hard enough to propel them into the middle of an intersection. Chapter 9. A Gala Event. Fortunately, the car just hits a curb and no one is hurt. It's a Christmas miracle! Nancy decides she wants to go back to the dance school, and they find the van parked outside. We need to call the police, Bess said. Nancy nodded. You're right. But first I want to make sure our culprit's not here. This time, he or she isn't getting away. Again, this is a terrible decision. Is Nancy just so desperate to get all the glory for solving this case? Is that why she's so resistant to calling the police? As the 2 girls approach the van, they realize someone's sitting in the front seat. Nancy opens the door. Immediately, a huge brown furry thing leaped out at her. It's the Mouse King headpiece. Be cautious. There's a naked furry running around here somewhere. After all that drama, Nancy and Bess finally head to the gala. Apparently, both Lawrence and Darcy have had moments where they've been absent from the gala. So one or both of them could have been the person in the Mouse King costume or the person driving the van. The dramatic ending of this chapter is when Lawrence and Darcy walk into the gala arm in arm, which I think is only a relevant and dramatic moment for about 5 people there. Chapter 10. A Sobbing Suspect. Look at those two, Shauna whispered. Lawrence struts back in like a peacock, and Darcy's got so much eyeshadow on she looks like a raccoon. She's trying to look sophisticated. It was at this point in the book where I just began to wildly suspect everyone, mindful of the Goodreads reviewer who said they guessed the culprit right away. I consider myself a fairly intelligent person, and this is a formulaic children's mystery novel. I couldn't let it best me, so I thought, maybe Shauna is the jealous one. Maybe she's sabotaging the school in a desperate cry for attention. Because it seems weird to be jealous of your younger sister, right? Especially when you're a dancer with a famous New York ballet company. Nancy even has the same thought. It looked almost as if she was jealous of Lawrence and Darcy instead of the other way around. Shauna says, Darcy accused me of trying to steal Lawrence away from her. Why would I want to steal Mr. Steele? She chuckled half-heartedly at her joke. Good thing she's a dancer and not an actor. That's all I'm going to say. Shauna then doubles down on accusing Lawrence, which is exactly what you'd do if you were actually the culprit. Divert suspicion onto someone else. The evidence is piling up here. Then Lawrence comes over and asks Shauna to dance. It depends. Are you going to waltz me into the dessert table, or toss me over your shoulder into the shrimp dip? I don't think there's any need for that. You already smell a little fishy, Shauna. However, she does accept Lawrence's offer. Something in Shauna's expression made Nancy think that Shauna really did want to dance with Lawrence. Was there more going on between the two of them than I'd thought? Nancy wondered. Maybe they didn't dislike each other so much after all. Textbook enemies to lovers. Nancy notices Darcy leave the room and follows her into the washroom, where she finds Darcy crying in a stall. Darcy accuses Shauna of stealing her man, then says, I wouldn't be sorry if my sister fell and broke her stupid neck. Chapter 11. Terror in the Snow. Darcy ran from the ladies' room. Nancy sprinted after her, but when she reached the door, it swung toward her and she had to jump back. An elderly woman wearing a high-necked velvet dress and pearls had walked into the ladies' room. It was Mrs. Farnsworth. Well, hello, Miss Drew, she said in a polite voice, but her gaze bore into Nancy like a drill. Have you located my ornaments yet? No, Nancy stammered. Mrs. Farnsworth really wants her ornaments, okay? It was at this point that I pivoted from Shauna and began to suspect Mrs. Farnsworth. She could have easily lied about her chauffeur dropping off the ornaments. And why would she turn up again if she wasn't important? Nancy manages to extricate herself from Mrs. Farnsworth, but by the time she gets back to the main room, Darcy is gone. The next day, Nancy and Bess join George for some skiing. While out on the slopes, a snowmobile approaches them. The rider doesn't slow down. No, they speed up, aiming for the girls with clearly murderous intent. Nancy and George get out of the way, but Bess's ski gets stuck. The snowmobile was barreling down, picking up speed, and the driver was steering right for Bess. Chapter 12. A Lost Clue. There's no way Bess is going to make it out of this one, but Nancy manages to grab Bess's jacket and haul her out of the way just in time. Not easily dissuaded, the snowmobile loops around and comes at them again. Nancy, get down, she heard George yell. Looking up, she saw her friend standing in the middle of the trail. George's skis were off, and she was holding a tree branch in both hands like a baseball bat. After seeing George, the snowmobiler apparently had second thoughts. With a roar of the motor, he turned around and headed away from them. I don't need a man to protect me. I need George Fane. Back at the dance school, the girls hear mysterious noises coming from within Madame Dugrand's office. But it's not Madame Dugrand, because she comes walking up while they're standing outside the door. Madame Dugrand unlocks the door and they step inside to find that the office has been ransacked and the culprit has fled through the open window. They realize that whoever was in there has stolen one of the pictures from the wall, and that therefore that picture must contain a clue. Chapter 13, Shredded Dreams. Ooh, what an evocative chapter title. Luckily, the problem that surfaced one page earlier is easily resolved. Madame Dugrand has a copy of the photo. The photo is of a group of dancers. A young Alicia Dugrand, in her late teens, was in the center, poised on her toes. The other dancers, all about the same age as Alicia, were dressed in their snowflake costumes and had their arms gracefully arched towards her. "Who's that?" Nancy pointed to a ballerina on the far right. Instead of facing the photographer, she was glaring at Madame with a hateful expression. "Oh my," Madame sighed. "That's poor Grace Turner, a lovely dancer, but so competitive. She was furious that I got to dance the part of the Sugar Plum Fairy. She claimed I stole it from her, but I didn't. I had to work hard for that part." This new evidence backed up my theory that Mrs. Farnsworth was the culprit. She's around Madame Dugrand's age, and we don't know either her first name or her maiden name. Nancy takes the photograph to the River Heights police station, and Chief McGinnis says, "I'll be glad to have our technician do an age progression on this." They had that technology in 1992? Even in 2022, I thought they mainly used police sketch artists to draw those mock-ups. And this small town police department has the ability to do that? Wow, they must be even better funded than I thought. "Where are we going now?" George asked. Bess pulled a face. "Let me guess. Back to the dance school, right?" Nancy grinned. "How'd you guess? But we'll stop off at Yogurt Heaven for lunch. My treat." The book doesn't say what they order at Yogurt Heaven this time, but I think we can assume it wasn't yogurt. Back at the school, Nancy recruits George to help her prepare some props for the show. "We just need to figure out who did it." "Who did what?" a deep voice asked from the doorway. Nancy swung around. Lawrence was leaning against the doorframe, his hands clasped behind him. For a second, butterflies fluttered in Nancy's stomach as she wondered what he was holding. Another tire iron? Perhaps a snake? Suddenly, the dancer thrust one hand from behind his back and into Nancy's face. Wide eyes and a wicked, toothy grin stared back at Nancy. It was the Nutcracker doll. Lawrence laughed. "Nasty-looking little fellow, isn't he? Is it just a coincidence that the evil doll makes a return just in time for the finale?" Then they hear a scream and run out into the hall to find Shauna with her Sugar Plum Fairy dress in her arms. The dress has been cut to shreds. Chapter 14. As time goes by, everyone starts accusing Lawrence and Darcy, and Lawrence feels the need to defend himself. "You want to know what Darcy and I did last night?" He let out a sigh. "All right. I didn't want to say anything, because Darcy made me promise not to. She's afraid of what might happen, and—" he hesitated. "Well, she's kind of embarrassed." "Excuse me," Mrs. Wolaski interrupted, "but I'd better go." Mrs. Wolaski does not want to hear this. When Shauna came back and Madame asked her to help with the choreography, I was plenty mad. I even tried to make Shauna look bad at rehearsals, trying to make her look bad by almost dropping her and causing her to break her neck. Darcy was really bent out of shape. Big time, Lawrence continued. She'd convinced herself that the part of the Sugar Plum Fairy would be hers, and, his cheeks flushed, she convinced herself that we had some kind of relationship. Oh, she convinced herself? What about the time you put your arm around her at Yogurt Heaven, or rocked arm in arm with her into a gala dance? I don't think Darcy's to blame for that one, chump. Lawrence also rats Darcy out and tells everyone that she was the one who filled the snow machine with soap. "And, what about you and Darcy?" Shauna asked, stammering. Nancy saw a deep blush creep up the dancer's cheeks. I told her we were just good friends, Lawrence explained, his eyes on Shauna. I guess Darcy thought otherwise. She didn't take it real well. This is Lawrence's only explanation for what they were doing last night, but I think that sounds like a pretty short conversation and doesn't account for all the time that they were unaccounted for, but no one else thinks to question him on it. The next day, Nancy returns to the police station and receives the completed age progression photo. The problem is, the photo doesn't really resemble any of our suspects. Until Nancy draws glasses, wispy strands of hair, and eye bags onto the photo. Bess leaned forward and peered down at the photo. "Oh no," she gasped. "It looks like Mrs. Wolaski." "I'm afraid so, Bess," Nancy said. "There's a very good chance that Mrs. Wolaski is also Grace Turner, the only enemy Madame Dugrand has ever had." Chapter 15, A Star in Peril. So Grace Turner has been disguising herself as an old Polish widow to enact revenge on Madame Dugrand, whose only crime was being a better dancer than Grace. Get a hecking hobby, lady. Stamp collecting, maybe, or chainsaw carving, or something like that. Nancy, Bess, and George hurry to the dance school to find that Shauna has been kidnapped by Mrs. Wolaski. They drive to Mrs. Wolaski's house, thinking that perhaps she's keeping Shauna there. Nancy says, "I guess we knock first, and if no one answers, we bust the door down," Lawrence growled. "Whoever kidnapped Shauna is going to pay." "Well, that's not exactly what I had in mind," Nancy said. I thought, I hope Lawrence brought his emotional support tire iron. Then on the very top of the next page, this happens. When she reached the front door, Lawrence stepped next to her. He held a tire iron in his hand. "I brought it just in case." He actually did! That's some beautiful payoff. Once they've broken into the house, the gang look around for clues and find some checks addressed to Roger L. Wolaski. Oh my goodness, Roger? If you're thinking, who's Roger? I don't blame you. Do you remember way back in Chapter 2, the piano accompanist that George compared to a mouse? His name was Roger, and shocker, it's the same Roger. You might be wondering if I left out some scenes, if you missed some additional interactions with Roger, and the answer is no. There is only that one incredibly brief scene with Roger in Chapter 2, and that's it. Mrs. Farnsworth has more scenes than Roger does. From these checks, Nancy deduces that Roger is in cahoots with Mrs. Wolaski. Whoever it was on Goodreads who said that they guessed the culprit pretty early on was a liar. There is absolutely no way they guessed that Mrs. Wolaski was a much younger woman in disguise and that she was aided by Roger, whatever his name is. I've literally forgot because he was only in one scene. It doesn't just come out of left field, it comes out of a field 2,000 miles away. Chapter 16. Pas de deux. As if this culprit reveal wasn't dramatic or wacky enough, Nancy guesses that Roger is Mrs. Wolaski's son, or some other kind of relative. "Roger Lutz is working with Mrs. Wolaski?" Lawrence said after Nancy had told him and George the news. "But he's such a mousy little guy." "No, Roger isn't a mouse. He's a rat." "Roger has to be Gertrude's accomplice," Nancy replied. "He had access to the building, and since he was always way in the background, no one suspected him." Yeah, it's like he wasn't even there most of the time. The gang head over to Roger's apartment building while George drives to the nearest phone to call the police. Tell me your book was published in 1992 without telling me your book was published in 1992. Nancy uses her lock-picking kit to break into Roger's apartment. Nancy was surprised to see Shauna sitting in a chair in the center of the room. Her mouth was gagged, and her hands were tied behind her with rope. Shauna looked at Nancy with frightened eyes. Then she tried to cry out in a muffled voice. "Shauna," Lawrence shouted, pushing past Nancy, "No, it's a trap!" Nancy cried. But it was too late. Someone sprang from behind the door and whacked Lawrence on the back of the head with a cane. The dancer crumpled to the floor. It was Roger. He turned and smiled wickedly. "Welcome, Miss Drew." He raised the cane menacingly. Just then, out of the corner of her eye, Nancy glimpsed something that would help her out of her predicament. It was the Mouse King headpiece, which she figured Roger and Mrs. Wolaski had stolen. Without giving Roger a moment to react, Nancy picked up the headpiece and swiftly yanked it over his head. From inside the Mouse King head, Roger emitted a muffled squeal of anger as he groped for Nancy. She had put the piece on backwards, so that Roger was completely blinded and had no idea where he was standing in relation to Nancy. He turned in a semicircle, desperately swinging the cane to try to strike her. Nancy tried to grab the cane, but just then Roger stumbled on a coffee table and, with a screech, fell to the floor. Crouching down, Nancy dug her fingernails into Roger's skin, squeezing the tendon in his wrist hard. He immediately cried out in pain and loosened his grip on Gertrude's cane. I love when they let Nancy be a badass. It gives me so much joy. Nancy ties Roger up, then hears a noise behind her and realizes Mrs. Wolaski is attacking Madame Dugrange. "You're not winning this time," Gertrude shouted to Madame. Hands raised like claws, she rushed for Madame's face. The directress nimbly jumped sideways. Then, reaching out with her leg, she kicked Gertrude in the thigh. Gertrude stumbled sideways and lost her balance. Then, with a cry, she rolled down the steps. Madame stared down the steps in silent horror. Her attacker was sprawled on the second-floor landing, not moving. "Oh, Nancy, I didn't mean to hurt her." "She gave you no choice," Nancy told her. "A ho-ho homicide!" Just then, 2 police officers came running up the stairs. They stopped on the second-floor landing and looked down at the body, then up at Nancy and Madame Dugrange. This doesn't look good. Luckily, Chief McGinnis arrives on the scene and absolves his favorite little detective and her friends of any crimes. Later, it's revealed that Roger is Mrs. Wolaski's nephew. He claims to have agreed to only help with her scheme if no one got hurt, which sounds like a massive lie coming from someone who repeatedly rammed the back of Nancy's car, tried to run Bess over with a snowmobile, and beat Lawrence on the head with a cane. Additionally, Mrs. Wolaski is claiming that there's no such person as Grace Turner, and that Madame Dugrange made it all up. Please, Mrs. Wolaski, only Carolyn Keene is unhinged enough to make something like that up. Finally, everyone gathers to watch the first performance of the Nutcracker. George leaned toward Nancy. "Another successful Nutcracker performance," she whispered, "thanks to Nancy Drew." I just want to do a quick tally. Yogurt ordered from Yogurt Heaven? 0. Food that is not yogurt ordered from Yogurt Heaven? 6. Just some food for thought. Food that's definitely not yogurt. Despite my roasting this book like it's a chestnut over an open fire, I did genuinely enjoy it. In my opinion, Nancy Drew books are at their best when they're at their most weird, and this book had some beautifully weird moments, like the fixation on Yogurt Heaven, the culprit running around in a 7-headed mouse costume, and Lawrence keeping a mischief of mice in his ballet locker. At the same time, there were quite a few plot holes and story threads that were abruptly dropped, but I'll cut the writer a little slack. These books were being absolutely churned out in the 90s, with 6 Nancy Drew mystery story novels published in 1992 alone. No wonder the content is more than a little delirious at times. Thank you for watching my content this year. I look forward to talking about Nancy Drew many more times in 2023. That sounds like a threat. Biss? Yes, my favorite Nancy Drew character, Biss Mervyn.